All right, so in the second part of our cartography stuff, I want to talk about the ways to make some of the things happen that we talked about in the earlier set of lectures. So we're going to talk specifically about three things here: hierarchy, font, and color. The first of these is hierarchy, and it's got a couple of different aspects to it. So hierarchy in the case of visual design refers to which things sort of pop out at you and which things sort of drop back. And you remember in the last set of videos we talked about map grammar and the fact that we have to sort of lead the reader through the map, because unlike a paper or a story or something like that where you're simply reading it from start to finish, we have to help the map user figure out where the start is and where the finish is. So we're going to organize the information into primary, secondary, and tertiary information, right? So I got a little graphic here to kind of help you with that, right? So the map itself is the primary stuff, right? That's the main event, and that's why people are here and what we want them to see and take away, right? The secondary information is the title and the legend. And you remember in the last video we talked about things that have to be on the map and things that might be near the map rather than on the map. So that's why it says here title if present. Right, the title might be in the caption as well. But primary is the map, secondary title and legend, and then tertiary information is scale, direction, and credits. Okay? And that has to do with, again, the order in which we want people to see things on the map. So we want them to look at that map first, and then we want to give them a little supporting information about what it's about and what the data is that's in it. And then last but not least, here's the scale bar, here's which way north is, and here's all of the information that was used to make this map. So we do this in a couple of different types of hierarchy. The first one is visual, right? Which things do we see first? What looks like it's in front of something else? So I'll give you a little graphic here. And what do you see first on this page, right? Chances are you either indicated this area here or this area here, right? That's where most folks gravitate because it's very dark and very solid. So it pops off the page as opposed to these lighter gray areas or even just the white background area. So the hierarchy in this map is drawing us down to that corner. Now, there's some other challenges with that, right? We've got us all pulled down to this corner. We're not making very good use of this space, but that goes into balance and not hierarchy, so I'm not going to go too far down that path. But these are the first things that most people notice on this page. What if that's not the most important thing that's happening on this page? What if this is the most important thing up here, right? If this is the most important thing, this is a problem because it's distracting, right? So you might have seen this in a meme somewhere, and I'll give you a second to look at it. And I found that, even as someone who was sort of expecting this behavior, I did exactly what it said, right? My eyes were drawn to the bright yellow stuff in the middle, and then I read the next largest text underneath it, and then I continued on down the page, because that's how we read, and then I said, oh wait, there's some stuff up at the very top, right? And that's very typical, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's totally fine. There's also nothing wrong with it if you read it in a different order, but this is the way most people will interact with the page. So the most eye-catching thing should be the map. You're probably familiar with this graphic or something that looks somewhat like it. What do you see first? Faces or vases? Right? Some people see the vase first, some people see the faces first, but this is the contrast between these two is the figure to ground contrast. And so when we're talking about the figure, when we're talking about cartography, we're talking about the map, the body of the map, the piece that we want people to focus on, and the ground being the background, right? So if we're talking about a map of California, for example, California is the figure and the Pacific Ocean is the ground, and the rest of the states are the ground, unless we're trying to do like the whole western half. But if we're just trying to do California, California is the figure. So we need a nice contrast between the figure and the ground, and we'll dig into that more in a second here. But I'll give you another graphic that plays on this particular thing, right? What do you see first? The longer you look at it, the more things you're going to see. Right? And this is absolutely playing on the figure to ground. So when we translate that to maps, we have to make that count, right? So I have here some land and some water. And I typically ask folks to point to me which one is which. but I'll just ask you to think of sort of the middle area or the edges, right, as ground or water. One of these is ground and one of them is water, right? You have in your head which one you think is which, right? Some of you make some decisions based on the shape of the line work, right? What if I do this? I now have a good figure to ground contrast, but which is the figure and which is the ground, right? Which is the land and which is the water, right? And again, some of you might look at some of these features and say, oh, well, that looks kind of like one of these. Maybe this, this might look like a river outlet to you. But on the other hand, if you look at certain places in the world, like the Crimean Peninsula, they look a lot like this, where there's just kind of a little island that's connected by a tiny little strip of land. So, it could go either way. We can help it out by adding roads. We don't typically have roads in the middle of the water, right? Doesn't happen so often. But we can help that out a little bit, right? And then we could also do the same thing within the road network. We could build a hierarchy. We could make certain roads darker or heavier than others in order to emphasize importance, right? But now we're pretty sure that this is the land and this is the water, yeah? What happens if I zoom out a little bit? You get a little more context. Many of you will recognize this shape. Because we're in California, I would say that most of you are going to guess this is the San Francisco Bay. But the Tampa Bay is not that dissimilar either. So you might need even more context, and you might still need a little bit of assistance with roads and so forth, right? So figure to ground is not a simple do this, and you're done. It changes a little bit depending on what's doing it. It's an element of context, it's an element of contrast, it's an element of content, right? So that's visual hierarchy. Now we want to talk about intellectual hierarchy. So visual hierarchy is kind of separating the land from the water, or the focus area from the background. But within the map then, what do I want people to notice first? What needs to stand out? What needs to drop to the background? Right? And then also probably some things that we could decide to leave out altogether. But of the things we've decided we have to have, what do we need to pop out? What do we need to knock back a little bit, right? So here's an example of a map. Everything's the same color and the same line weight, and it's really difficult to tell in some cases where things are and what they are, but in other cases what's important, right? So since this particular map is about a series of serial murders, one would assume that the location of the bodies would be one of the important pieces of information, right? It might also be relevant because it looks like there are contour lines on here. Evidently terrain is important. There seems to be a cluster along the bank of this creek. So the terrain is important, but the terrain right now is interfering with a lot of stuff. So we want to be able to talk about the terrain without having it be too much. And then also I would say that the proximity to the city is significant as well, right? So here's a redesign of that map. A little easier to figure out what's happening, right? All that information is still in here, but we've pulled out the most important information, which is the location of the victims, right? Then we have developed a hierarchy of roads, in fact, a couple different line weights or line treatments for roads here, right? And then we've also handled the topography in a way that lets us read it, but without it jumping and screaming for attention, right? So when you throw everything in ArcMap wants to make it all with the same color outline and the same weight and everything else. And you're going to get something that looks like this. So it's your job then to sift out that information and present it to your reader in a way that they can digest it. All right? Visual hierarchy is also related to how you lay things out on the page, right? So on the left-hand side, I've got a pretty well-organized page here. I've got a great big block. Remember, the map is supposed to be big. Great big block for the map here. I've got some things here, probably a legend and some credits and things like that, and then a nice big title. And we've used pretty much the whole page. So your book talks about the visual center. I've made use of the visual center by putting the focus area right where that is. On the right hand side, not so good, right? The visual center is right in here, and the map is kind of in it a little bit maybe, but not a whole lot. So it's not super helpful in that way, right? And then these other blocks up here are competing for attention with the map. And then I've got all this wasted space, right? So if you have this whole page to use it, right? Take up every moment that you can. You need to leave a little margin for the printer, but take up the rest of the page, right? right? Now, when you're making maps for GIS reports, we'll tell you in some of the later labs that you'll need to export those maps at a smaller size, right? Like a 6x6 map, but in that case, your paper is basically also 6x6, so you're still filling up that entire space. But even within this space, let's say this is our little 6x6 map. This is just a jumble. It looks like things were just chucked in here, right? And so we need to organize that a little bit better. All right, in one of your labs, you were asked to make the background blue, the data frame background blue, which is a great way to fill in the ocean and make it, you know, take the place of adding an ocean layer or a water layer, but you want to be careful when you do that, right? So this is a map of the world. Obviously, we've got everything on here to a certain degree of generalization. And somebody said, oh, well, this is ocean, so I'm going to make the background blue, but there's a problem. None of this is ocean. So what you've effectively done is change the size and shape of the planet, and that's going to be very distracting for people because they're going to say, wait a minute, there's not that much ocean up above Greenland. That doesn't make any sense. All right, so be careful about using the background of the data frame as the ocean unless it's absolutely everything is ocean. All right, here's an example from The Economist. This is, normally The Economist makes some really lovely maps, but I felt like this one was a little confusing. And so, you know, try to figure out what the focus is here, right? What jumps out at you first? And so people will commonly say things like, oh, the North Pole sticks out because it's right there. Or the red stuff sticks out. Or they might start looking at the legend and then start finding some of the areas and finding that. So it's a little confusing. This map is largely about oil and gas deposits and indigenous land rights, but there's also some line work in here for sea ice extent, so presumably the article that goes with this also talks about the impacts on the climate of harvesting these resources. So there are a lot of competing things here that are fighting for your attention, and it's super important to really help organize this for the viewer, right? Think about how you want to do that. So the sea ice extent, rather than introduce a bunch of new colors, might have been maybe do that in a light blue or something with two different line types to indicate the two different extents, and then decide whether the land rights or the deposits are the more significant thing. And maybe the deposits are, and that's fine. If they're red, that's good. But it's also a little confusing here because you've got two things going on here, the Inuit and the Sami. And the Inuit kind of blend in, right? These two greens are very compatible and they sort of blend together and they look like they're related in some way. And then the Sami is sort of this other color that kind of sticks out. And so it's a little confusing because you're like, well, what is this other green? Is this another population that we should be thinking about? And kind of it is, but yeah, there's just a lot of things happening here, and they haven't done a super good job of sorting that out for people. All right, so be careful once you start piling on more and more data, it's going to get harder to do this, right? And so be very clear in your head about what you want people to take away. All right, so I'm going to stop this video here, and then in the second one we're going to talk about font and color.